Welcome and thank you for attending today's technical assistance webinar. This webinar is presented by Amity Foundation, acting as the third-party administrator for LA County's Justice, Care, and Opportunities Department and the JCOD CFCI Care Grants. The CFCI, or Care First Community Investment Grants, are the result of ballot measure J, which was voted in by LA County residents in 2020. Care First Community Investment Funds are intended to be invested directly into communities and alternatives to incarceration that address negative outcomes caused by racially driven criminal legal system inequities and long-term economic disinvestment. Today's webinar is being recorded. You do not have to be on camera. Understand that if you are on camera, your image may be captured in the recording. Staying on the webinar represents your consent to being recorded. Please do note the following legal disclaimer. You can see it on the bottom left-hand side of your screen here. The material presented today does not constitute legal advice and is only intended to provide information. Organizations and individuals should independently verify that any information presented is appropriate or applicable to their own situation before acting on it. Next slide, please. Oops, let's go back to centering community. Thank you. At Amity, we incorporate teachings that center the community before we begin our work. Today, we will use the LA County Land Acknowledgement to recognize the price paid by individuals that has resulted in efforts such as Care First Community Investment. We recognize that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in the genocide of the First Peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. Next slide, please. Thank you for attending today's technical assistance webinar. In honor of National Disability Awareness Month, we're going to present just sort of a brief overview of 101 on accommodating disabilities, a guide for California nonprofits. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters. My name is Rebecca Gray, and I'm the grant administrator for Amity Third Party Administrator. Mina?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mina Cabrion, and I am the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator here at Amity Foundation.
Thank you so much, Mina, and thank you for all the work you're doing to make this presentation run. Mina will be available later on for questions. She's running the chat questions, so we'll both be talking toward the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. All right, so again, as I think I mentioned, it is National Disability Awareness Month. I always like to remind people, especially people who are under, say, the age of 40 or so, that disability is a fact. Disability is a fact in every life. If you get old enough, you will encounter some form of disability. Sooner or later, your eyesight will not be what it once was. Your hearing will not be what it once was. You know, your fully capable body that you may be inhabiting at this point, at some point, will experience disability, the disability that comes along naturally with aging. So there is baked into this life, there is an importance of accommodating disabled people. When we adequately accommodate and represent disabled people, power imbalances weaken, work environments become more innovative, trust between colleagues increases, financial performance of organization increases. We will predominantly use identity-first language, such as saying disabled people, as opposed to person-first language, such as saying people with disabilities, For decades, many professionals, including myself, were taught person-first language in an effort to remove disability from people's identities. And person-first language, saying people with disabilities, just like saying people of color, is still commonly used in the medical profession, as well as by parents of disabled individuals, especially in the United States. However, proponents of the disability justice movement posit that disability is not a bad word, and efforts have been made to embrace identity-first language and to reclaim the word disability itself. So identity-first language, I'm going to be saying disabled people very purposefully throughout this presentation. The objectives of this presentation are to understand the legal requirements and best practices. And again, this is just an overview. So we will be talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. We will be talking about, for us specifically in California, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. And we will have resources so you can look at these two requirements that affect your organization in more depth than we will go into today. And we also want to identify resources and support available during this presentation. Just a little nugget, a little data for you. According to a study by Respectability in conjunction with the Chronicle, Philanthropy, and the Nonprofit Times, 66% of nonprofit workers, that's all of us working in the field, 66% of workers reported that their organizations serve disabled people. And 72% stated that their organizations have publicly committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is a national survey. I would bet these numbers are quite a bit higher in California. However, in the same survey, only 59% of the workers reported that their own organizational events were always physically accessible. Only 30% include requests for accommodations on event registration forms. Only 14% utilize video captions, which are often free and automated, which reminds me to start the captions. Let's show captions. All right, and the caption function is free, and just like I just turned it on, you can choose to see this or not on your own view, but you can always employ captions. Next slide, please. So up to 1/4 currently of all Americans have some type of disability. In fact, in getting older, disability becomes inevitable as we experience more difficulty seeing, hearing, thinking, and moving. If you are currently under the age of 35, chances are 1 in 3, that you will be disabled for at least 6 months during the course of your career. Men have a 43% chance of becoming seriously disabled during their working years, and women have a 54% chance. What is the definition of disability? A person is considered to have a disability if he or she has difficulty performing certain functions such as seeing, hearing, talking, walking, climbing stairs, lifting and carrying. And again, this is directly from this American with Disabilities Act, this federal law. Or has difficulty with certain social roles, including working at a job or around the house. That is part of the definition of disability. This is down at bullet point number 3, but I really want to emphasize this. Not all disabilities are visible. Many physical, mental, or neurological conditions that are non-apparent or invisible disabilities can limit or challenge a person's movements, senses, or activities, and can impact that person's ability to learn or work. So I'm going to do some self-disclosure here and let you know that I do identify as a disabled person. And for most, I think I'm not sure that anyone would look at me and immediately clock that. But it is a fact for me and many other people who you would not otherwise think of as disabled. Many people with non-apparent disabilities get unnoticed because others are not aware of their conditions. Common non-apparent disabilities include cognitive dysfunction, chronic fatigue, sensory processing disorders. They also include autoimmune disorders, depression, diabetes, vision impairments, and trauma, among other conditions. And I'm hammering that, like I'm bringing this home because in work environments, we often have a habit of judging our coworkers on their performance, or we've all been brought up in a system that emphasizes equality over equity, you know, which means that we were all handed the same sandwich, or we were all handed the same bicycle, so now we're equal, or we were all given the same apple box to stand on, so we're all equal. And equality does not equal equity. There are many people who can't use that bicycle. There are many people who cannot use that apple box. Equity is about different strokes for different folks, and that's an important part of recognizing and putting forward disability rights. Next slide, please. So what does employment discrimination look like? And here I put up the California, because it affects us, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, some of the bullet points of FEHA. Yeehaw, FEHA, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. What employment discrimination looks like. State laws barring discrimination apply to all business practices, including, and this goes for nonprofits too, your advertisements, your application screening and interviews for employing people, hiring, transferring, promoting, terminating, or separating employees are affected by FEHA and the ADA. Working conditions, including compensation, participation in training or apprenticeship programs, and employee organizations or unions. All of these things are touched by the ADA and by FEHA. The Fair Employment and Housing Act applies to public and private employers, labor organizations, and employment agencies. It is illegal for employers of 5 or more employees to discriminate against job applicants and employees because of a protected category such as disability, or retaliate against them because they have asserted their disability rights under the law. FEHA prohibits harassment based on a protected category against an employee. And here, this is really important, not just your employee, for people employing over 5 people, not just your employee, but your unpaid intern or volunteer, a contractor, a third party. Harassment is prohibited in all workplaces, even those with fewer than 5 employees. So even if you have fewer than 5 employees, harassment can still be brought against you. Slide 7. So what are your key obligations? So as a California nonprofit, like, what are some of the applications? What can you do not only to protect yourself, but to also protect disability rights, and make sure that everyone who's employed by your organization contributes everything that they are capable of. So the physical, I'm going to look at these on this slide, these 3 key points, these key obligations of physical accessibility, digital accessibility, and communication accessibility. So in physical accessibility, we've got ensuring access to facilities, which means all of your entrances and exits need to be accessible. Often that means that your doorways need to be a certain width so a wheelchair can get through them, things like that. If you have parking for your organization, you must include disabled accessible parking spots. Also in physical accessibility, you should have ADA compliant features such as ramps and elevators for wheelchair access, wide doorways and hallways, accessible restrooms with grab bars, and space for maneuvering. Then we've got digital accessibility, another key obligation, website and digital content accessibility. Later on in the slide, we've got a resources slide, and these slides will be made available to you, so you can go back and look at these things. You can follow links to your heart's content. But there is a web content accessibility guidelines document, the WCAG, and we've got a link to it on our resources slide to help you make your web content more accessible. You can ensure that the text that you use and any visual, any print that you're using, that it's readable by screen reader technology. So we've got screen reader technology happening right now since I turned on the captions, which is there's software that is translating my spoken word into visible text. So you want to make sure that your text, and we have some AI, like we've got those AI note takers here today. and they need to be able to, quote, read off of the slide. And you know, we've got a really, I love our slide design. I think it's really pretty, but one of the defaults, it defaults to orange text. And we've gotten, when we were giving these webinars in the past, like probably 12 months ago now, and we used that orange text, we got complaints that people could not read the orange text. So you know, for those who can see all of those colors of the rainbow, like seeing black text on slide after slide can get a little monotonous, but it is important for readability and accessibility for all. You should also always provide captions and transcripts for videos. And I frequently forget to hit my caption button, but on Teams, it's available to have captions enabled. On Zoom, you can have captions enabled. I highly recommend providing caption. I saw when I was doing research for the slideshow, I saw that 80% of people who use captions on their TV, and probably captions for things like this, are not hearing impaired. It just helps to see the words scroll by, like you can deepen your understanding by watching the words scroll by. So captions and transcripts. Under digital accessibility, accessible documents and media. PDF is the most widely accessible form. So if you're going to allow people to download content from your site, PDF is often the format to use. If you use images, you should include the alternative text feature so that people who can't see can still read what the visual, whatever image you've put up, what it contains. You should ensure contrast and font size are appropriate. So no teeny tiny text, you know, a lot of white space, all of those things are important. For communication accessibility, there are 3 points here. You can provide sign language interpreters, offer American Sign Language interpreters for events and meetings. You can use assistive listening devices, provide devices for individuals with hearing impairments. And you can use alternative formats for written materials. And I have yet to attend an event or sit in a presentation where I was offered something in Braille. So it was interesting to see that. So large print, Braille, and electronic formats are all things that you might be able to offer to people who are attending your event or who want to look at your materials. Next slide, please. Also, under key obligations for California nonprofits. Next slide. It's important to think, so here you are, California nonprofit. You've looked at the ways that your organization, you know, how you can have an accessible space for your workers, but you should also apply this thinking to all of your programs, program accessibility. You should modify programs for inclusion, and you can do this by talking to anyone who has a disability who uses your program, asking them to complete a short survey or asking them what they think. So listening to and believing disabled voices is important. Respecting if any of your attendees have self-identifying language that they prefer, just like pronouns, like attention and sensitivity to people's preferred pronouns. Use the language that the person with a disability might prefer. Use inclusive language. Use plain language. If an issue of accessibility or ableism is brought forward to you by one of your program participants, you should take it seriously and resist defensiveness. And I know it can be hard, like it can be hard to feel like you're being put on the, you know, you're being, you know, put to the wall. You're being like, your methods are being questioned, but try to listen to what the person is saying about what needs to be made more accessible. You should not, in your survey of anyone of disabled people who might be using your program, you should not overburden them. It is not their responsibility to make your program accessible, right? You should not be trying to use them for free labor. It is your responsibility to know what in your program can be more accessible. So there are accessibility consultants out in the world, out in the wild. You can always employ an accessibility consultant to look at your program and come up with ways to make it more accessible. Often making things accessible is as simple as offering a remote, letting people attend remotely, and or making other accommodations for programs. In events, ensuring events are accessible. Consider the layout of the event and the venue, including how people arrive, the distance between activities, the food offerings and logistics, the seating for both guests and speakers. And again, here's an opportunity to hire an accessibility consultant. Other considerations for your event always include feature diverse speakers, offer non-alcoholic drinks, provide financial assistance to attend events, enforce a code of conduct with a clear grievance protocol. Be forward thinking and research possible accommodations. Is there a lights off room for someone to take a break who gets overstimulated by fluorescence? Do you have flexible seating? Things like that. Next slide. So, and finally, I did want to address for those of us in the, running a nonprofit in California, this is a big deal, is employment accommodations. Disabled people may need support to participate fully in their school, workplace, or community. These supports or accommodations can be achieved by having appropriate adaptations or modifications of typical equipment, schedules, or work plans in place. The accommodations and or modifications needed are tailored to the individual and their unique strengths and needs. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified people with disabilities. Reasonable accommodations are changes to the job, work environment, or application and hiring process that allow a person with a disability to perform the job's essential functions and have equal employment opportunities. Accommodations, this is important, employers, accommodations are considered reasonable if they do not create an undue hardship or direct threat to the employer. So if it's going to threaten your financial stability to reconfigure a space, especially a space that you don't own, that is definitely taken into account. So you are protected by undue hardship or direct threat to employer. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of reasonable accommodations. You can make existing facilities used by employees or job applicants readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. You can participate in job restructuring. For instance, if someone is required to work 8 hours and what they need is to split it up throughout the day, that working 8 hours in a block is not possible for them, they can still get their 8 hours in by doing maybe a 2-hour, 4-hour, 2-hour schedule. Part-time or modified work schedules, telework, reassignment to a vacant position for which the employee is qualified. So for instance, if someone, I think this mostly, this particular bullet point is referring mostly if someone can no longer lift the required amount for the job they're in, for instance, is there another position at the organization where they could also do the work, but they're not required to lift that amount? Acquisition of modification or equipment devices, appropriate adjustment or modification of examinations or training materials, providing qualified readers, people who can read aloud text, or interpreters, people who can sign. Next slide. So I know that this sounds like a lot. I know that many of the things that have been suggested here are very apparently expensive, right? Time consuming. It doesn't mean they're not worth it. Fully tapping the talents of disabled employees is only a benefit to you, only a benefit to the employer, only a benefit to the larger society. But you should know, employers, that employees who request accommodations, often they must provide medical verification, right? This isn't just a employee talks to their employer or even goes to HR and says, I need accommodations. they do need to provide verification of their disability. So as part of the reasonable accommodation process, it may be necessary for the requesting employee or applicant to submit medical information to substantiate and or clarify the nature and extent of their disability and or limitations. Employees are not required to, nor shall they be requested to, provide a diagnosis or genetic information. You're not, they are not required to tell you what their diagnosis is. Pursuant to state and federal law, medical information obtained in the process of addressing requests for reasonable accommodations shall be kept confidential. Employees and applicants may submit medical substantiation via email, regular mail, facsimile, in person, or by other acceptable methods of delivery that allow confidentiality. So again, if anyone, including someone who's applying for a job, has given you their medical information, you should go watch our webinar on HIPAA because you now have protected information, and you do need to protect that medical information. It is a requirement. Next slide, please. All right, other obligations that you should consider as I feel like we covered like the 5 major ones, but here's some other things you should consider as an obligation is training staff and volunteers, the importance of training. Training increases awareness and compliance and reduces your risk. If you train everybody on their on the California standards, on the American with Disabilities Act, then you reduce your own risk. It also ensures staff are prepared to work with and assist disabled people. Key training topics could be disability awareness and etiquette, legal requirements and best practices, specific accommodations and services. You should also, you should think about, what does emergency preparedness look like? If you have employees who are also disabled people, you would need to plan for that. You should include specific needs in your emergency plans and ensure that your evacuation routes are accessible. And you should have inclusive evacuation procedures, that your staff and volunteers are trained on assisting disabled people, and you can provide emergency information that is accessible to all. So again, your Braille, you know, your large format print, things like that. Next slide. All right, so where can you learn more? So I'm gonna tell you, my first resource here is really more for entertainment purposes, but it is also so educational. For those of you who haven't seen Crip Camp, it is fantastic. It's an award-winning documentary that you can get on Netflix. You can also find out more about it at the link that we've provided here on this slide. And again, these slides will be made available to you and will be posted on the Amity site, and you will receive more information about that. But also, here's a link to the California Department of Rehabilitation. They're the ones who are in charge of enforcing the FEHA, the California disability laws. Employment and Independent Living for Californians with Disabilities since 1963. That is your California State Department of Rehabilitation. Also linked to the American with Disabilities Act, required reading for employers. And also Disability Rights California. This is the largest disability rights group in the nation. So if you are on the employee side and you're wondering how to begin this conversation with your employer, that is a place to start for you. And as I stated before, the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, these are national guidelines. I found them going through a federal government website. So this is trustworthy content about things that you can do to make your web content more accessible. And finally, we are at our Q&A. Next slide. Ms. Mina, are there any questions in the chat?
Let me scroll through. I don't believe I saw any in
I think I saw any
here.
come through. And again, I understand this is a very broad overview. I'm hoping we gave you some resources to track down answers to your own questions, and we may be able to answer some larger questions.
There are no questions, Rebecca.
All right.
Yeah,
Be
no.
inclusive, disability rights, pumping the
Did,
fist.
did anyone have any questions now that they could just come off of mute? Doesn't seem
Doesn't look like we have
like it.
questions today. No
Okay.
worries, that's all right. If you have questions later, you can always email us at TPA grants at amityfdn.org. I think we are going to say goodbye then for now. Maybe we will
Yes.
see you next Wednesday.
Or they can, if they have any questions, they can also reach out to their grant advocate. Their grant advocate is always an amazing resource to reach out to. Thank you so much, everyone. As Rebecca said, seems like because there are no questions, we can definitely let everyone go. Just a reminder, next week we do have the site visit tool. It is a mandatory training for all CFCI grantees. So a webinar link was sent out, and we will send out an email reminder on Friday with all of the details for that training. And I guess that's it. Thank you so much and have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.